Good afternoon and happy National Moth Week. Thank you for joining us for another webinar. My name is Felicia. I am the Outreach and Education Coordinator for the Missouri Prairie Foundation. Today, MPF Executive Director Carol Davit will be interviewing Margo Farnsworth about her forthcoming book, Biomimicry and Business, How Companies Are Using Nature's Strategies to Succeed. Margo works as a writer, biomimicry educator, and consultant in strategic sustainability development for organizations. She has served as faculty and visiting faculty at several universities and advises students in North America and abroad as a fellow for the Biomimicry Institute. For over 2 decades, Margo has served the people of the Southeast U.S., working as a naturalist and later for the Cumberland River Compact as executive director, then senior fellow, for which she was awarded the National River Hero Award. While there, Margo brokered a bi-state water agreement between Tennessee and Kentucky, advised 2 presidential administrations, and facilitated work in watershed associations committed to healthy, plentiful water. Projects range from water energy-friendly homes development to measurement of carbon sequestration value of buffer zones and sedimentation reduction for restoration and deploying green infrastructure. She has coached 2 top 12 graduate teams for the International Biomimicry Challenge and worked as a judge for the Biomimicry Global Design Challenge in recent years. She serves as an advisor to the Grow Native program, Missouri Prairie Foundation, and is a board member for Deep Roots KC and advisory board member for South Carolina's Experience Green. Her writing can be seen in the anthology Wildness, Relations of People and Place, in addition to Earthlines, Outdoor Living, The New Territory, and others. Her forthcoming book, Biomimicry and Business, How Companies Are Using Nature's Strategies to Succeed, will be released this fall by Routledge Press. It is hailed by biomimicry leaders and tells the engaging stories of business leaders using biomimicry, the lessons they've learned, and the ways readers can deploy biomimicry at their companies. We are excited to bring you these webinars as we celebrate the 20th anniversary of the Grow Native program. Please visit our website for more information about upcoming events. We have another interview next week with Alan Brandhagen about his new book. We have some field trips and walks scheduled for this fall. We have September pre-order pickup native plant sales in St. Louis, Kansas City, and Springfield. And we have our free virtual annual dinner event on August 28th. If you have any questions during this presentation from Margo, please type them in the chat or the Q&A section and we will ask her. Thank you, and let's hear from Carol and Margo.
Thank you, Felicia. Margo, thank you so much for being here today. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. So your new book, and if you're just joining us, my name is Carol Davit. I am the Executive Director of the Missouri Prairie Foundation, interviewing author Margo Farnsworth about her new book, Biomimicry and Business, How Companies Are Using Nature's Strategies to Succeed. Your book is told in a very engaging manner. It's told in a series of stories. And you write that it's written purposefully for, the quote, the tire kicker. Can you explain what you mean by the tire kicker, about the audience that you envision for this book?
Sure, and before I do, I just want to say thank you to you, Carol, and to MPF for having me, and Felicia for that really nice introduction, and for all of you for coming today who are listening online. Yeah, the tire kicker, there are a lot of books out there in sustainability land, and when you hear the term biomimicry, it can be a little bit intimidating if you are not from a biological background. And I wanted to, reach those people, or want to reach those people who are curious about it. They've heard the term and they might want to find out more, but they're just a little bit hesitant because of, and that's why I told it in the story format, that a colleague of mine collaborated with me on bringing in information from case studies, because at the back of every chapter about whatever company I'm talking about, there's a lessons to be learned section. And a lot of those statistics are from case studies. But if I can just read 4 lines from Pack Scientific, the chapter starts like this. Squinting his eyes as he studied the sparkling water, Jay watched his hands pull whirlpools alongside the wooden dinghy as he rolled with the Australian surf. How could a 9-year-old have guessed those liquid funneled shapes would lead him to start future multi-million-dollar businesses and be called upon to lecture audiences around the world? So I hope that, you know, when people read that, they go, okay, this is just a story. I can get in with this. And so hopefully we'll pull in more than just the biologists, engineers, and industrial designers that are already using biomimicry.
Great, I agree. It's very effective. In the book, you tell stories about businesses and entrepreneurs who have, quote, consulted nature for answers. And you have a really fascinating story about Nike and goat hooves, how they were inspired to mimic goat hooves for a product. Could you tell a bit about that story?
Absolutely. It's funny because the designer that worked on this Goat Tech shoe really didn't know about biomimicry, but the people that work at places like Nike a lot of times are the same people that are going outside and doing things. And so he was thinking about adventure racers and how to make a better shoe for those adventure racers that went cross country and across rocks and through creeks and all of that. And so he thought about a mountain goat and how they have to go along skinny little ledges, but then they also have to go traipse across steep rocks. And so the goat hoof, the mountain goat hoof, has a very stiff outer edge and then a soft, pliable sole so that it can either perch or it can smear, and so that it can stay on the side of the mountain. They didn't really get into biomimicry per se at Nike until they started into green rubber, which we can talk about later if you want to.
Great, thank you. And what I liked about that chapter was it wasn't just this one product, but Nike really transformed so many things about how they operated, really examining many layers of sustainability. And so just to read about how they went about that and that evolution was really fascinating. And I would like to know your evolution, how you got interested in biomimicry.
Well, I always read at least one technical book, and then I'll read a book for fun, and then I read a technical book, and then I'll read a book for fun. And so I read what was the early new iteration of biomimicry. It's been around for quite a while, but in 1997, Janine Benyus wrote Biomimicry, Innovation Inspired by Nature. And when I read it, I thought, oh, I've got to check with the other instructors at the university, because I know multiple of them have to be using this because it just makes so sense. It's so logical. And I went to my director to see who was using it, and he said no one was using it. And so he said, do you know where you can get training? And so 6 weeks later, I was in a jungle in Costa Rica, you know, getting the training for it. So it was for my MBA students who were working on sustainable MBAs.
And where were those students?
Those were in, well, most of them were in Tennessee. We had some online students too that were from different parts of the country, but most of them were from Tennessee.
Do you remember when you first heard the term biomimicry, when you first came across it?
You know, when I read the book and I read about the Mistral, the guy who was walking through probably a prairie, it was a field, and his dog got burrs on his coat. That's, I think, when I wherever I heard that story, that's the first time I heard biomimicry, because he, of course, went and looked at the birds under a microscope and saw that kind of hook and loop possibility, which is where Velcro came from.
Yep, great. In the book, in speaking of biomimicry, it's a relatively new term, and you talk in the book about some related terms like bioinspiration and bioutilization. And could you talk a bit about how all these terms tap into, I think it was maybe the author of the book you just showed up calls the genius of nature, or maybe it was a different author, but I think that might be helpful if you could just talk a little bit about how those terms all tap into getting inspiration from nature, from the genius of nature.
Sure. Biomimicry is unique because it is, as it sounds, it's mimicking nature. But with some rules. If you are truly performing biomimicry, then you are complying with Earth's operating conditions, like gravity is always going to be here, and the world operates in cycles. And so you're complying with those, and you're hitting at least some of life's operating conditions. And when I talk about or life's principles, sorry. And when I talk about life's principles, I'm talking about things like in nature, organisms adapt to changing conditions. They evolve to survive. They are resource efficient, meaning they're material and energy efficient. And so Earth's operating conditions and life's principles are sort of our level of application with biomimicry. Whereas with bioinspiration, you might remember an artist long ago who, Leonardo da Vinci, that saw birds and really just said, oh, wings. Oh, maybe people could fly with such things. And so he was inspired by it, but he really wasn't looking deep down, although he did a lot of research on birds. Wasn't looking at those specific strategies and how they complied with the world around him. Bioutilization is simply using an organism to accomplish a task, like a sheepdog to herd sheep, or bacteria at a water treatment facility. And so there's several other bios, I call them cousins, in the book. And a group of us that are working on this together feel like certain ones are appropriate for different applications. And so we just call the whole group BioM star, and then try to be very meticulous about when biomimicry is being used, or when bioinspiration or bionics, etc., are being used.
And I'm sure a person could be inspired at one level and then move to another. For example, the example you gave with a bird in flight, but then mimicking the feathers and the beak structure or whatever for some other purposes, and then really following those principles of biomimicry. The Nike and the goat hooves is an example in your book that you give of using a structure or a form in nature, but in your book you give many other examples of mimicking processes or systems in nature. And I wonder if you could give us a few other examples, because they're really fascinating.
Well, since you liked the Pack Scientific, and because it has a local application, I'll tell you a little bit about it. That was actually what I opened our talk here with today. Jay Harmon was an Australian, and he was always fascinated by those funnel shapes, but also by watching how kelp moved underwater, and later looking at lilies and how spirals, he kept finding spirals in nature. And so eventually, in addition to some other inventions, he created a fan based on that spiral. And one of the applications he uses it for is for a fan that sits, you know, we see water towers all over the Midwest here in small towns, and Smithville, of course, has one. And so there's a small fan, only 6 inches tall, that sits in the bottom of that to mix the water. So if you don't mix water in those big tanks, then as it gets warm, harmful, well, trihalomethanes, but harmful substances can form. So you have to constantly mix it. And so that fan, moving all the time, can move with the energy of 3 100-watt light bulbs.
Wow.
10 million gallons. And this isn't a 10 million gallon tank here, but that's what that fan can effectively move. And even though he was looking at it for that particular purpose, they also found that it helped keep the water in those tanks from icing as well. So I was, because I'm a science person, I was talking with my local water provider, and the subject came up about the tank and trihalomethanes, because I'd seen that some things that were a little bit high in our water system here. And she actually told me that they were using one of the PAX fans right here in Missouri.
Wow, that's great. Another thing I liked about what you wrote about Jay, that's his name, right? It is, I think he went to engineering school, he was miserable. And thanks to his tenacity, he pursued, but what if he hadn't? And so maybe we could adapt, you know, how we're teaching as well to give value to the children who are mesmerized by how kelp move in water or the funneling, and not dismiss it and really embrace it. And so I think that's a whole other aspect of this, and of not only business, not only individuals, entrepreneurs harnessing or applying principles of biomimicry, but then creating a formal education system that really allows for it and allows for that exploration of ideas. So, but hopefully when people read your book, including educators, you know, that hopefully will happen. Other examples, you might want to share another example about using a system, or I thought the example of this, looking at how bees swarm or other social insects was just amazing. I don't know if you'd like to just share a little bit about that story.
Sure, that is a company called InCycle, and they were motivated by the blackout in the Northeast. If folks remember in the early 2000s when everything went dark in Northeast US and Ontario, and they were working on an energy, you know, thinking about a business that had to do with energy anyway, and they were like, okay, this overpowering the grid, we need to look at something that has to do with energy management. And they had read Stephen Johnson's book, Emergence. So they knew about emergent principles, and what those are basically, some people think that the queen in, say, a beehive is what is the creature that controls everything that goes on. But actually, it's a mixture of biological programming and biochemical signals that they send each other. And there's a mathematical algorithm that goes with that. So they came up with an applicable algorithm based on bees, and applied it to heating and cooling HVAC units on large, like gymnasium size or factory size or movie theater size buildings that have to have more than one HVAC unit on their roof. And so before, whenever it would get too hot, all the fans would come and kick off at once. And that's sort of our tradition in the modern world, is having this kind of behavior happen in our electrical grid. And so they said, what if we could have the HVAC units actually talk to each other? Wow. So they ended up creating a transmitter that could talk to each other, and they actually knocked the top off of that peak. So they saved the producers of the energy in the area, peak demand. They saved that, the first company that they did this with was a movie theater company, and they saved $35,000 in the first 6 months. And they knocked 28% off of a school's bill, which they were then able to push back into their students. And they were another, to your point earlier, they were another who people said can't be done. It needs more testing. It's not time yet, but it was just their persistence, as just like Jay's, that kept them moving forward. They knew that it could work.
That's incredible. And when you're talking about those cost savings and just better products, it excites me as a consumer, because I want products that are going to serve me well. But I want them not just for myself as a consumer today, but as a consumer down the road, and for the future of all consumers. That is, if we don't act in a sustainable manner, consumers will have less ability. There'll be fewer natural resources, a diminished pool of resources from which we can create products. And so you have these well-made products, and those are benefiting the people who are creating them. They're benefiting the consumers. And you talk about the triple bottom line in your book, and I wonder if you could tell us more what you mean by that term, and how biomimicry and its family of principles are supporting that concept.
Sure, absolutely. In business, we always talk about the bottom line, and we're always talking about the economic bottom line. But as sustainability has moved forward, and now we're talking about not just sustainability, but regenerative business. This term, the triple bottom line, came about because we need to make economic success, whatever that means, and that's a whole other interview. But then we also need to have benefits in terms of the environment and in terms of people. So it's people, profit, planet is typically the way people refer to it. And so to give examples, the Interface, when they made their carpet based on the structure and the sort of the patterns of a forest floor, they doubled that division within 5 years, and that carpet is still one of their top 5 selling brands. And at the same time, they cut their waste by 70%, and they went from 2 gallons per square yard of material down to half a gallon of water. So whatever, a gallon and a half of water per square yard of carpeting. So that's one. PAX is still experiencing 40% growth annually, that's an unheard of sort of number. But at the same time, responsible for saving energy. If you only have the cost of 300-watt light bulbs,
right,
to mix all the water in that tank, that's a huge savings. And then sharklet, which we haven't talked about yet, but they mimicked the skin, the denticles of a shark, originally they were looking for a way to keep barnacles off of naval ships. But what they found accidentally was that it shed bacteria.
Yeah.
And eventually they created an endotracheal tube and several other things, but just on the endotracheal tube alone, it shed 99% of bacteria compared to a traditionally made endotracheal tube. So there's benefits to people there, and profit and planet among all of those.
Yeah, and it makes sense if we think about in the natural world, animals in so many cases have evolved an efficient design so that they are maximizing, flight on so many calories, say, or they can swim, so many miles on a set number of calories. And so if we're adapting those same kinds of design principles, we could be using energy more efficiently, like those examples that you just gave. I've been fascinated by biomimicry for a long time, and not only as a consumer, but also, in my career of getting people excited about the natural world, conserving the natural world, and helping to highlight the intricacies of nature. Biomimicry really excites me because it means we have to pay close attention to nature. And so you talked about, I think in some of your research and preparation for this book, and just in your studies about biomimicry, you talked about, and I'm quoting you, quieting our own cleverness, or quieting cleverness. And do you mean by that about studying nature carefully, like taking ourselves out of the equation, or what do you mean by that?
That's a term that Janine uses a lot, and I'm glad that over time, she and I have had more time to talk, and I've learned so much from her. But that term that she came up with, we are so often, and I know I'm so guilty of this. We hear a problem and we immediately move to the solution. We want to start moving into that solution space. And, if we could just quiet our cleverness and go outside and just be still. And it's I tell you, it's kind of disorienting at first. When I was first out in the jungle, when we arrived down there, and they said, go out into the jungle and we'll come get you when we're ready for you. And I never did that to my students because I know I was like, well, what, and they said, and just observe. And so when I started sending my students out into the woods or onto the prairie, I could see those looks of, a little disorientation and whatnot. But once they got out there and once they were still and were told to look at boundaries between maybe where water starts and where the plants on the riverside, start, look at those boundaries. What functions do you see happening? And so they would come back after the first, I only made them go out for like 20 minutes at a time. And so when they came back and we started talking about it, then every time I would send them back out, they would get more excited because they were starting to learn from nature. And then they wanted to know what more could they learn from nature. Mm-hmm. So if we can just kind of get out of our own head and get out of our own way, yeah. and let nature teach us.
Yeah.
It's amazing what we can learn.
Yeah, great. There might be some entrepreneurs or business people attending today, which is wonderful. And of course, your book is all about applying principles of biomimicry to business. But for sure, everybody who is in attendance is a consumer. And could you talk a bit about what role can consumers play in, not just promoting sustainability or renewable self-generating, principles, but really biomimicry. What role can consumers play in advancing this and making it more prevalent in the kind of consumer behavior that we have? How can we help kind of promote it?
Well, it is a lot like moving towards sustainability or moving towards regenerative action, because the first thing you do in any of those is you start to ask questions. And so you'll do your own sort of consumer research. And to give you a couple of examples, since you asked it this way, where I did this when our house burned during the middle of writing this book, which was an interesting sort of thing to happen. And so we were replacing the windows. And so I had known from my research that a company named Ornolux had mimicked how spider webs have a UV reflective, some of their strands have UV reflective material on them. And so they started putting them onto windows to reduce the number of bird crashes. And so I just asked my window people, hey, have you heard of Ornolux? And I think, I didn't know, I doubted that they would have it, but I feel like anytime that you can help enlarge someone else's world, and I think it works that way in business too. So that was one example. And, the PAX fan here saying thank you to the water company. I'm so glad you're using this technology. This is impressive. It's impressive for a small town to be using a biomimetic, tool. So those kinds of things. And then I think we move beyond consumer into the realm of citizen. And so, a lot of these things we do, like planting natives, are things that can promote life diversity, and that gives us insects and birds and plants that otherwise might not be available to consult. And so I think the more we can do that just as citizens, the better we are off.
And I think too, your point about the Ornolux is simply helping to create demand by mentioning these products or these techniques or services.
Exactly.
And you just touched on there too about what I also am very happy about with biomimicry is, and you devote a chapter about this in your book, about conservation of native habitat and biodiversity. And as you know from being a past board member of the Prairie Foundation, we protect original prairie. It's some of the most diverse and species-rich habitat left in Missouri. And it's very complex and very intricate, and all of those, in form and structure and systems and processes. And if we don't save this original habitat, we'll have diminished nature to mimic. There's so many examples that could have promise, like how do prairie soil microbes, how do they cycle nutrients? And if we don't have prairie to study that, how can we ever, apply that, potentially apply that to something that's going to improve our lives? Or how a bee, how certain bees travel from flower to flower to collect pollen. But could you share a bit more, and you started to talk there a bit about your insights from that chapter, and why that's important to you?
Well, first I want to acknowledge, and this is one of the reasons that I've always been, since moving here and discovering the Missouri Prairie Foundation, such a fan, because it's not just, the psyche is not just, oh, we're protecting, land because we like grass or we like flowers or whatever. It's this bigger understanding of how important biodiversity is, and that if we don't protect places like prairies, they won't be here. And we talk about how they won't be here for us in our future enjoyment. And, you know, I talk about, you know, how they serve us in our businesses, or can serve us in our businesses as inspiration or actual mentors, if we look deeply at the strategies of the organisms that live there. But it's really bigger than that. And I think one of the things that I talk about in that chapter is the idea of reciprocity. You know, the other organisms that exist on this earth have a right to be here. You know, it goes beyond how they serve us.
Right.
There is a partnership, and that's one of the things that I love about biomimicry, is there's a back and forth between non-human organisms and the human organism. And, you know, I think that's that's critical to our survival long term. It certainly is critical to the richness of our life. But the great thing is that when you look at how companies can deploy that, it can be as simple as, you know, biophilia, one of the cousins, you know, using organic shapes and plants in the office and things of that nature. You can move into doing things like a company in Jessup, Maryland that I visited. They grew they had gardens on site so that they could give the building space lessees, I guess they were the lessor and leasers of their space. They got the space for this certain amount of money, but they also got vegetables and flowers for at their front desks and things of that nature. A company that I worked with in the Southeast started very small with using native plants and compost tea, and they drove their business demand just sky high because people hunger for a way to do this, all the way up to large companies like Bridgestone that are protecting, you know, huge masses of land. And they do it partly, you know, in some of the offices in their headquarters. I'm sure that they are all about the PR, but they also very much work in the realm of bioinspiration. In fact, one of their tires was modeled after a polar bear, the sole of a polar bear foot. So all kinds of reasons, and you can do it at every scale. So just do it, as Nike would say.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much, Margo. Your book, Biomimicry and Business, How Companies Are Using Nature Strategies to Succeed, will be published this fall by Routledge Press. Can you talk a bit about how people can buy the book? And you also have something special for the registrants, which we can send out tomorrow. Could you talk about that, about how people can get the book?
Well, I thank you to Prairie Foundation, because you guys are the first organization to offer a 20% off. Routledge made a special flyer so that the listeners on your website or on your webinar here are going to get a 20% discount. And it may be a little confusing when you first look at it, because Routledge is based in England, in Great Britain. And so because I work with people from, you know, Kazakhstan to, you know, Kellogg, Michigan, you know, I needed to have a publisher that would be able to go worldwide. So don't be thrown by the pounds that you see, because that's what it's. And I think that I did the conversion rate today. It's about $30 with today's conversion rate, but you know, it changes from day to day. So thank you for sending out that coupon to all your listeners and watchers.
Great. And that will have the ordering information that will on that sheet that Felicia will send that out to everybody tomorrow.
The book will actually be out in late September to early October. And at that point, I imagine it's going to be on Amazon and all the other places. I'd like to get it into Hudson bookstores and in airports once we get back to not being worried about flying, because I did make it a short enough read that it could be something that a business person could, you know, consume. And it's not a big investment of your time,
yeah.
But hopefully it'll be a larger investment in terms of the innovations that some of you anyway come out of with it. I also wanted to mention while we were here that Amanda Gian is a wonderful artist here in Kansas City, and she was wonderful enough to do the cover art for this. And thanks to Janine, because she helped me figure out what the name was going to be. So
great. Well, we do have some questions. Suzanne asked, did you find the glass you wanted for your windows?
I did. Unfortunately, it was priced more for what an office building would be able to buy their windows for than what a residence. But since that time, you could only get it from Europe, and now they're making it here in the US. So Orlux has US offices. So imagine the price is going to continue to come down. So
yeah, and the more we all ask for those kinds of products, that increases demand. And
absolutely.
Yeah, great. Here is a question from Paul. Asks, is any work being done with photosynthesis as a solar energy collection system?
Yes, there is something. You can go to SMIT and put solar ivy in the search bar, and that's what they call it, solar ivy. And a young man and his sister actually started a company, and they have put these, it looks like ivy, it's very pretty to look at, and they are miniature solar panels, and they put it at the Naval Yard in one of our eastern seaports, and then they've been putting them on the outside of walkways of apartment buildings. So it's actually a safety feature too, because it keeps people from going over the edge. But that's not what it was designed for. But yes, so nice question. Good question.
Great. He also asked, can energy be harvested from trees? I'm not exactly sure what he means, and maybe he'll follow up with a little more clarification, but maybe you know what he means, Margo.
Not quite sure.
Well, we'll hold that, and maybe we'll hear back more from Paul. Yeah. A question from Eileen. Can you explain how water use is quantified for production of foods and goods? You mentioned the reduction in amount with carpet production. So how is a water use quantified for production of foods and goods?
Well, I can't go to the food place because that's not my area. Permaculture person would be a great person to talk to specifically for that. But in terms of goods, it depends on what company that you're working with. When I'm talking with companies, I give them a choice. We can either move from the front of your property to the back of your property, or we can move from the top of your property to the bottom of your property. And so if I'm saying, let's say the Carroll Company, I'm working with the Carroll Company, and so we might start at the very front of your property and start looking at your stormwater expenditures, and so how we could mitigate those and make those less, and so on and so forth. And then we would start looking at each of your processes. And so, you know, when I was talking about interface carpets, they require a certain amount of water to make those carpets. Now, embedded in our energy system, not to get too wonky, but to get a little wonky, in our communities. You know, it takes water to make energy, and it takes energy to clean water. So that water energy nexus is big. So you're not only calculating the water that it takes to make a product, but the water that your overall company is using or saving, if you're using green infrastructure, for instance. But then also looking at the water that you are saving. If you're saving energy at your facility, you're also saving water for your community.
If I could just add too, I was, it's not really related to biomimicry, but how how design changes fuel costs. And, you know, the more you can tightly pack goods, say on a truck, you can, you know, reduce fuel costs. And so it is so fascinating, the intersections of design and energy use and water use. And on another related topic of kind of a trend, I think, of sort of industries being physically located close together so that the waste products of one can be used by, or a byproduct of one company can be used by another, which in a way is bioinspiration. If a tree is, you know, the leaves are falling from the tree, the soil is made there. It's not made somewhere else. It's made right there. That's so that's sort of mimicking nature, or at least being inspired by nature. Okay, Paul has gotten back. He says what he meant about can energy be harvested from trees. He says tree mimicry, any energy collection on this level.
So one of the student teams that I worked with were looking at how they could reuse old abandoned silos. Any of us who live here in the Midwest have no doubt driven by abandoned silos. And so he wanted to grow hydroponic tomatoes in silos. And he wanted to look at the way that trees move water. And so create a watering system based around that. And we are not yet at the area that that we have perfected that capillary action, harvesting that capillary action, but a number of researchers, not only in the US, but around the world, are looking at that very thing, because it makes such sense, right, Paul? I mean, it's good stuff. Now, we're also looking at trees because we're understanding more and more about the ways that they communicate with each other underground in the mycorrhizal network. And so there's a lot that we can learn from trees. And in the way they branch, architects are looking at the ways trees branch to make things, or their root systems. They are already deploying systems in some coastal cities, mimicking mangrove roots and the ways that those hold the sandy soil from coastal cities in place. And so there are a lot of different ways, but since you asked about energy, that's what I can tell you without going too long.
And I noticed we all, including myself, give examples of trees and not prairie. But another example about prairie that I learned recently is when we're looking at storing carbon, if we mimic or be inspired by a diverse original prairie, the root architecture, how you have netted roots and then tap roots, that diversity of root architecture can allow, if I'm understanding correctly, more carbon to be stored than it could otherwise if, say, you had a monoculture of a prairie plant that had all netted roots. But having that diversity of the netted structure and the tap, you get more. And so, yeah, just another example of turning off our ideas and observing nature for hopefully, you know, better answers.
Well, and just to follow up on that, the polyculture of a prairie, all those different, just exactly what you were talking about, the Land Institute is now looking at growing its crops in a polyculture manner. And one of the huge benefits to get back to our listener, watcher, who was asking about calculating water, you look at a prairie, and that polyculture is 8 times better than a monoculture at stopping erosion. So just a little research tidbit there. So there's multiple benefits for biodiversity.
I think we've got one more question, also from Paul. What's going on with mimicking dolphin skin for vessel movement efficiency?
You know, I should know this. They are not one of the company. There's a company called, I think it's Ecovative is what I want to say. And I've been working more with Tony in terms of shark skin, but you're right. They are doing work now looking at not only the skin of dolphins, but their sonar is being used actually by a company right now to be an early warning system for tsunamis. And so that has been deployed, and their tail fins are being looked at, the way they move in the water to generate energy as tides come in and tides go out. There is a vertical finned fish that they're looking at and comparing the two. Another Australian company is doing that. So multiple ways they're looking at fish and marine mammals. But I'm sorry, I can't tell you more about the dolphin skin. I should know that.
Well, I think we've addressed all of the questions, and thank you so much again, Margo. I feel like I could just keep hearing these stories for hours. And I'm sure everyone here would like to know more, and you can learn more through Margo's forthcoming book, Biomimicry and Business, How Companies Are Using Nature's Strategies to Succeed. And Felicia with MPF will be sending an email to all the attendees today with that coupon and the ordering information, as well as information about some of our upcoming events, including our virtual annual dinner on August 28th. It's going to be really great, and hope everybody can participate. We also have some in-person socially distanced plant sales coming up different locations throughout Missouri in September. And do look at our websites and visit our prairies and observe and enjoy and be inspired. Thank you so much, Margo, and thanks everybody for tuning in.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Bye.